Now, here's why I share all that. See, one thing that I think you got to get is I found that sometimes when the thing we thought was going to be God's avenue to bless us, when the relationship we thought was going to be the thing, or the job or the career we thought was it, I think sometimes God will actually change it and mix it up on purpose. Like God will sometimes change the method so you won't mistake it for the source. So get this. I'll use your father to bless you, but your dad is not the source of your blessing. I'll use Potiphar. I'll use the guy in charge of the prison. I'll use him. I'll use your boss to give you some favor. But listen, your boss and Potiphar, listen, they're not the source of your blessing. He can use them to pour out favor. He can use them to pour out blessing, but they're not the source of your blessing. See, he'll mix it up to remind you that listen, as God, listen, I can use people, but I don't need people, because at the end of the day, it's God who blesses you. Your favor comes from God, not from people. And this is key that you get, because if it comes from people, it can be taken away from people by people. If my dad can give it to me, then my brothers can take it away. But if God gives it to me, if God is the source of my favor, if God is the source of my blessing, not my boss, not my this relationship or this situation or this job opportunity, he can use it. But if that's not the source, if God is my source, then listen, you can put me in a pit, you can put me in prison, you can lie about me, you can cheat me, you can vote me off a deserted island. Listen, if God favors me, there's nothing you can do to stop me. And the same is true for you and in your life. See, sometimes God is just trying to remind you that he is your source. And regardless of where you're at. Oh, but that person, she left me and she was everything. Listen, God is the source of your blessing. He's the source of your favor. Yeah, he could use that person, and maybe he did for a season. But listen, he's not dependent on that. He's not restricted by that. Listen, God is the source of our blessing. And sometimes he'll mix it up to remind you, because listen, if he didn't mix it up, it would have been really easy for Joseph to sit there and get this all confused. To see his dad as a source of all of his favor and all of his blessing, or his boss as that. Never giving the one person credit that actually deserved the credit, and that was God himself. See, sometimes the thing you thought was going to be the thing doesn't turn out to be the thing, because God wants you to remember he's the thing. He's the source. He's the source. And so, we see this happen, and kind of again back to the story, you got to understand also that there's a little bit more to the story than just what we always kind of read on the surface as well. Like there's more actually happening in this, and we see this in a verse that, again, I think is really easily kind of just overlooked, kind of glossed over. But within it, there's a key phrase that actually I think the entire story of Joseph hinges on. And we see it in Genesis chapter 37, verse 36. And again, let me read it for you here. So, I mean, again, he's, going through this back, he's just kind of thrown into the pit. His brothers, they make up this story to their dad, Jacob, and Jacob's crushed by this news. I mean, he's heartbroken. Because again, with Jacob in this, I mean, it's one thing. It's one thing when you're kind of going through it, some circumstances that they're sort of out of your control. But Jacob, he had to have felt so much responsibility for this. Because it's like he doesn't know how this story is going to end. He just thinks that, okay, I asked my boy to go check on the other brothers, and he's dead now. Like he's gone. I mean, that's what he's thinking. So he's thinking, I'm the cause of this. I'm the reason that he's no longer here. I'm the reason that he's gone. And so look what it says here, verse 36. It says, Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Meanwhile. And in fact, I actually want to read the couple verses just in front of that to get context, because and why this is such a significant kind of hinge point. Again, when Jacob first hears the story, verse 34, verse 35, just before this part. It says, then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. I mean, he's broken. Jacob's broken. And yet, what's the next verse right after that? Meanwhile. Now, I was a terrible student in high school and much of college, especially in English. But if there was one thing I got, it was that I do understand that there's certain terms in English that can speak to different perspectives in literature. Well, like there's first person, there's words that speak to a first person, like terms like I and me, and then there's a second person point of view, and then there's this. This is the third person point of view. This is a point of view, it's a perspective of somebody that's involved in the story, but also over the story. They can see it from the beginning to the end. They know how it's working. They're involved on all spectrums of the story. Meanwhile, and here's why I love this. Again, go back to this Jacob here. He's broken. He's just gotten this news. He's hurting. And then what's the next verse? Meanwhile. Listen, I don't know whether you realize this, regardless of the situation you're in, no matter how seemingly insurmountable, how overwhelming it is, you need to know that there is a meanwhile to your story. Meanwhile, while Jacob was weeping, God was over here still working. Amen. While Joseph was struggling, God was over here, doing a work. He was making things happen. He was starting to orchestrate and put the pieces together. Even when Jacob felt like he had failed, listen, there was a meanwhile. God was still working to fix it up. Listen, there's a meanwhile to your story. You got to get that, especially when you feel like you're in a Joseph situation or a Jacob situation where it's like man, I messed up, I've screwed up, I'm in this situation, it seems so overwhelming. There is a meanwhile. There's a God who is over it all. He's working on your behalf, even when you can't see it in the moment. Is anyone thankful for a meanwhile in your life, a God who is over and above it? So again here, as we kind of wrap this story up here, again, there's a meanwhile. There's more to the story happening. Now again, remember the story began with a dream given, and yet it's going to end with a dream realized. Because again, you got to remember the whole point of this story. The whole point of the story was that God had given Joseph a dream. And he was going to work that dream into reality to basically help his family out in a time of famine. And not just help his family out, but he would ultimately have a dream for and a desire for Joseph's life that he was going to be used to help save an entire nation. And which leads to kind of the question, I mean, how do you get a nobody shepherd boy from Canaan to ultimately rise up to the ranks that he would, which would be basically the second most powerful guy in all of Egypt. Amen. I mean, he was the guy who was basically in charge of maintaining the structure, some of the basic things. Certainly, he was in charge of the distribution of food when it came to this crisis that was kind of going on in the land and in that time. So how do you get Joseph from the pasture to the palace? Well, for many of us, there's what I like to call the expected path. And I think we got a picture. This is the expected path. This is how a lot of us, and certainly how Joseph would have expected things to go. Like, I got this dream. One day, I'm in the pasture. I got a dream. Next day, I'm going to be in the palace. That's the expected path. Joseph, it was like, man, maybe if I just sleep at a Holiday Inn, I'll wake up, next day, I'm doing this. And by the way, it's funny, I was thinking about this, my boy, he's got a lot of expected path stuff too. I mean, a couple weeks ago, he was telling me how he was playing his guitar, and he was telling me how he was going to, basically pack out these arenas with his concerts, and even to the point where he had it down to how he was going to dismiss everybody from the concerts, like what he was going to say. Now keep in mind, my boy's not had a single guitar lesson, has no idea what he's doing with the guitar, but he already has, in his mind what he's going to say to dismiss them. And it was really kind of a cute little thing. He's like, I'm just going to tell them, hey, thanks for coming. See you next week. See you at church. I'm like, oh, that's really cool, buddy. But he had an expected path. And listen, you and I, we do the same thing too. See, if you're anything like me, by the way, you do this a lot when it comes to driving. I've got an expected path. And that expected path typically is a straight line path, right? It's like the fastest. What's the fastest way to get from point A to point B? It's all about the interstate. It's all about the freeway. All about the best way I can go fast and get there in the quickest amount of time. But that's not the way God typically works in our lives. The way God brings us from the pasture to the palace, certainly we see within Joseph's story, and I think we see it really throughout Scripture, is this tendency to always take us through detours. See, there's the expected path, but then there's the experience path. This is the experience path. The experience path is, here's Joseph. He starts out in the pasture. He's got this dream, and then he gets, runs into his brothers. They're not happy about this dream, and what happens? He ends up in a pit. And he ends up in the pit, and as he's there, he gets sold. God's favor shines on him, lifts him up again, even out of this unfavorable situation, finds himself in the household of Potiphar, only to have another unfavorable situation kind of try to bring him down, drag him down, ends up in a prison. And yet even in the prison, even in this detour, God's favor is on him because he remains faithful and lifts him up to the second highest in command in the nation of Israel, nation of Egypt, in this palace, in a position to be able to help his family, position to be able to help his nation. See, this is the path that God tends to lead us, because, there's a couple things you got to get about detours real quick. See, I don't know if you've noticed this, but detours always take you farther than you thought you would go. You might have had a plan, like I'm going to get to Seattle, and then all of a sudden there's that accident on I-5, you're headed north, and a detour will take you much farther than you were thinking you were going to go. And here's why that matters. It's because, again, what was Joseph's dream? And Joseph thought that the dream God had for him was maybe at best. First he thought there was going to be an opportunity for revenge of his brothers, right? But maybe in his best good-hearted season in his life, maybe he thought, hey, I'll have an opportunity to help my family. But God had such a bigger dream. God wanted to take him so much farther than that. God had a plan that, hey, look, I'm not just going to use you to save your family. I'm going to use you to save a nation. See, God will sometimes lead us down detours to take us farther than we thought that we would go, that we maybe even dreamed, or we even imagined, or we even planned on our own. See, sometimes the detour is the door to more in our lives. Sometimes the detour is the door to more. Sometimes what you think is an accident is actually all a part of God's providence, that God's plan is to bring you further than you could have ever imagined or ever thought on your own. I wonder what detours you're complaining about right now that are actually doors to more. Places and opportunities that he's trying to open up for you to experience more of his grace, more of his purpose, more of his blessing. But not just that, though. Yeah, detours, they take you further than you might want to go, but it's even more than that. Again, you got to think about this. Joseph, he was in this process. This was not just an overnight process. All those journeys on the experience path, this would actually happen over the course of 13 years. That's a long time. It's safe to say there was more than a few times that he was in one of these detours and he thought, this is over. Like this is done. Like what happened to this dream? What happened to this call that you put on my life, God? I don't get this. And here's what you got to get about detours. Yeah, they'll take you farther than you thought you would go. But here's the thing you really got to get, is that, do you ever notice that a detour doesn't ever change the destination? A detour doesn't ever change the destination. Yeah, it can delay the destination. That dream God's put on your heart, that call that he's placed on your life, it can distract me, it can depress me, but it can't deny me the destination. I may have to circumnavigate and end up in some towns in the middle of nowhere. In fact, some of you, that's where you're at. Some of you, you look at your marriage, you look at your relationship, and it's like you're 10 years into it, 15 years into it, and you're like, this is not how I thought it was going to go. This is not where I thought I would be. Maybe God put a dream on your heart, a plan in your life, and you're like, this is not how I staked it out. This is not the expected path. You're looking around and you find yourself like out in Christmas Valley, Oregon. When you look at your condition of your life, like this is, whoa, like where did I go wrong? You thought the relationship was going to be this, but the relationship you're in is such a long way off. You thought the career would be this, and it's failed to live up to anything that you thought it would be. And again, while certainly the detour can depress you, it can distress you, you got to know it cannot deny your destination. In fact, the Bible puts it this way. It says, the giftings and callings of God are without repentance. In other words, it means God never changes his mind about your destination. Your destination is not up for debate. Yeah, sure, you got off course. Yeah, maybe you took a wrong turn here or there. But listen, I'm telling you, if you'll remain faithful with the next step that's right in front of you, if you'll sit there and not just give up and not just allow a detour to become a dead end in your life, you'll keep pressing towards him. You'll keep pressing towards that dream. You keep pressing towards that call that he's put on your life. If you won't let off the gas pedal, I'm telling you, it might depress you. It might distract you. It might take longer than you thought it was going to take. But eventually the detours are going to lead you to your destination. But you can't stop. You got to be faithful. You got to keep pushing on. My favorite verses in the Bible, it talks about this reality of a God who, the God who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. Do you believe that tonight? I want to pray for you this evening, and I want to pray first.